conferences and there's ideas floating through the world. I have a friend who went to Baylor, which is traditionally a Baptist college, and they're not allowed to drink or dance there, but they have a gym class called Rhythmic Movement, which is dance class, but they call it Rhythmic Movement. So this is not that. This is an intellectual movement. And so here we have St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City, probably the highest profile Gothic revival church in the US. As they say, paid for by the dimes and pennies of Irish immigrants. And quite an amazing big building made of stone, and had a big altar here, very much like yours, or a big altar piece. But you see the altar is only this little thing right here. This very big altar piece for a very big church. And that's what it looked like. Very impressive. Statues of the apostles and everything, very grand. But see, the altar is just this little thing right here. And in the late 1930s, early 1940s, they decided to tear this down and replace it during World War II. It's kind of an amazing thought. Why would they do that? And this is the same thing close up again. You can see it's quite elaborate and very big. And they replaced it for particular reasons. During World War II, they had all this trouble getting materials, and they didn't have the workers because they were all away at war. And they replaced it with this bronze canopy. It's called a baldacchino. It's a 4-columned canopy. And then you see the altar under there. And it won all kinds of awards for being beautiful. And you see it today in this bright golden bronze. It's very impressive. And there are actually statues in the columns themselves. See the little statues right there. There's a statue at the top, little angels here and lilies. And this was a big deal. The question is, why would anybody do this? And if you go to the book about it, they said that this canopy was very important, and it was replaced, and it was a study that was concerned with the architectural perfection of the building to enshrine the divine presence. In other words, the Eucharist would have a proper enshrining. And there's a lot of text here, but the design of this architect covers the table. They're already calling the altar the table in 1940, and the canopy is over it. It was rarely used in American churches until this time. And then with the sanction of remote antiquity, in other words, the early Christian churches did this, and then there are various canopies of different kinds. And what they hoped was that if they worshipped properly, with the saintly portraits and all that, that the World War II would come to an end. They actually said this: if liturgy were done right, proper worship would happen, then people would be transformed by grace, and World War II would end, and architecture was part of this process. Kind of an amazing thing to think. So this is what it looks like close up. And there was a very impressive big marble altarpiece, sort of a grand version of the one you had here, and they took it out, and their saints in the pillars of the church are these pillars of these churches, very elongated statue figures. And you can see some of the details up here, these flowers growing up, and then the angels with trumpets doing different things. Now they took down their big marble altar, but they put back something very, very grand, and they were saying at the time more architecturally sophisticated. And so this was a movement that went all over the place. These marble altars, although they were nice, they were kind of hiding the altar proper, because the altar piece was winning the day. But this is not a simple thing. They have this diagram of all the statues of the saints, and these were all made in bronze, and they went in all here. So you have the saints, you have the garden, you have the heavenly image, but it lets the altar step forth and be seen quite distinctly, including its cross and its candlesticks. And so they thought this was better. The old altarpiece was nice, but the altar was kind of lost in it. Now you can see the altar has a covering, and that they considered a better way to do it. So the before was pretty good, but they thought that the after was better. And you see those dates, 1942. When was your church renovated? 1940-ish, right? And so this was in the air, and you were a pretty cutting-edge parish to be doing what they were doing in New York liturgically, in Nebraska at the time. So what I want to do is introduce a couple of things to you. One is, where did this Gothic revival come from? Why did they do this renovation? So basically, it's how do we get from your first picture to your second picture, and then how does this happen in the context of Vatican II? So there's a guy named Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, who's not a household name, but in the field of architecture, he's very well known. There's actually a beautiful documentary on him by the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, that's free on YouTube. It's called God's Architect. And he was a convert to Catholicism right after Catholics were allowed to be Catholic in England. It was 1829. Before that, you weren't allowed to be Catholic. in England. And so he was raised as some kind of Protestant, and then he had this conversion moment, and he fell in love with English Middle Ages, and he wrote this book called Contrasts, a parallel between the art of the 15th century, that's the medieval period in England with Gothic architecture, and the 19th century, that's of his own time. And you may know this building, which is the Houses of Parliament. He was the guy who did all the Gothic ornament. He worked with another guy named Charles Barry. But Big Ben, he invented Big Ben. There had never been a Gothic clock tower in the history of the world. And he figured out how to do it and build the new Houses of Parliament. And if you've seen some of these places, the House of Lords meet, and you have this throne for the Queen and all of that, you might say, oh, this goes back to 1200. This was all brand new stuff. And nobody had been doing Gothic for several centuries, and he had to figure out how to do it. And so he would go to all these old country churches, and he would pull paneling off the wall and find the original paint and sort of figure out what they would do. They found the ancient vestments from the medieval period, and then he wrote all these books about them, figured out how to do a lot of this stuff. These tiles here are called encaustic tiles, and nobody had made them from since the Middle Ages, and he recovered the art of that and stained glass making. It kind of died out in the previous centuries, and he brought that back. So in his book Contrast, he says, this is the Christian town in 1440, very pious, filled with steeples everywhere. And so you come in from the country, and there was a cross where they would give out food for the poor, and you would pray there, and then you go halfway across the bridge and stop and pray, and then you go in the city and then pray all over the place. And this was the ideal. This is like the Shire, if you're a Lord of the Rings person. This is the Catholic Shire. Everything's perfect, your pipeweed and your second breakfast and all that. And he says, in 1840, what has this town become? It's a prison over here, and you have to pay a toll to get across the bridge, and they took away all these places where they gave out food for the poor, and then the city has been replaced by factories, and the church towers have been knocked down and replaced with smokestacks. So this is very much a 19th century thing. Charles Dickens is writing like this, the Oliver and the kids in the workhouses and all of that. Here's the residence for the poor in the Middle Ages. Very romantic vision that you would go to the monastery, and the nice abbot would take care of you, and he would give you alms, and he'd give you bread and cheese and wine, and if you died, they'd bury you with Christian burial, and they make you, listen to the homilies, and they teach you. And so this is what the poor did in the Middle Ages. In the 19th century, the poor were sent to debtor's prison, and the families were ripped apart over here, and the master, instead of being the abbot, was a guy with whips and chains, and they put you in a cell, and the food was just gruel. And when you died, it actually says over here, for dissection, they would sell your body to the scientist. Right? So whether this happened or not, exactly like this, interesting question, but it's a polemical argument. And so you hear these all the time, in the 60s we did this, and now it's time to do this, or, the societal movements happen. So what he thought, the answer to part of this was architecture. That this classical architecture that came from Italy in the Renaissance and came into England was not very good. And you see, this is the end page of his book, and it's called the Libra Excellentiae, or the Scale of Excellence. And here is a mirror with an eyeball in it, and the little hand down there. It's holding up the mirror, and above the mirror it says Veritas, so it's the mirror of truth. In the scale of excellence, one Gothic cathedral in England weighs more than all these classical buildings that came in this 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. And so there's this revival that authentic English people should do authentic English architecture. And before the Reformation, authentic English people were Catholics. And so getting behind the Reformation, getting behind the French Revolution, so he says they are weighed in the balance and found wanting. And then there's a whole list of these buildings over here. And so this is serious stuff for his time, and it was incredibly influential. He wrote these books, he gave these lectures all over the place, he built churches all over the place, including Australia and New Zealand. He would draw them and send models to Australia. And he didn't build any churches in the US, but the people who were convinced by him did. And so you have these Pugin juniors who build churches all over the place. These are some of Pugin's churches, some of his early churches. This St. Chad's in Birmingham Cathedral was the first Catholic cathedral built in England since the Reformation. And it's fairly simple, it's brick, and so you can see maybe the lineage of your church here, red brick church, Gothic inspiration, pointed windows, and the inside of it is being restored slowly. In the 1960s, they gutted this entire interior and painted it gray. And so now they're trying to bring it back a little bit at a time. When you see some of the historical examples, you'll see what they haven't brought back yet. But everything covered in gold, gem-like colors, patterns in the ceiling. And what this guy Pugin did is he went to these old churches, he found the remaining medieval paint, and he put it all in a book called the Glossary of Ecclesiastical Ornament. It's about that thick, and you can go through it page by page. Has anybody been to the Newman Center in Lincoln? If you look up at the ceiling, you will see things right out of Pugin's book from the 19th century that they basically copied out of his book that he found in medieval examples and then they used just a few years ago. This is the historical interior. They had what's called a rood screen, which is, rood is the Old English way to say rod, which is the word for the tree of the cross. And so the screen here, and they took that out in the 60s because they thought it blocked people's views, and they took out the pulpit and they wound up somewhere else. They're trying to get these pieces back little by little. And here's some of the restored pieces, the Lady Chapel there. So this was the 19th century vision that the Middle Ages was awesome, it was colorful, it was gem-like, it was jeweled, it was Catholic, it was English. And then these ideas spread all over the place. Now the Germans are saying, well, we have German Gothic architecture. Let's make our own German Gothic revival. The Irish are doing it, the Spanish are doing it. And, it comes over with different architects from Europe. Or someone like, a place here would say, let's find the best architect around, and he'll find something out of a book and do that. Now, the flagship of this Gothic revival was St. Giles in Cheadle, England. So London's down here, Stavacher's up here. And there was a rich Catholic lady who said to Pugin, build the best church you can build, I'll pay for it. This is an architect's dream, right? Like, don't worry about the budget. Just, I'm gonna stick it to my finger in the eyes of the Protestants and say, look what you gave up, and look what we're able to do now. And so this is the back of that church. When you see flipped around on the other side, they put it in a very particular place at the end of the street so the door would be seen and the tower would be seen. And you think about that little church with this giant tower, there's a lot of polemical stuff in here. How do we show what we are able to do? And here's the inside of it. It's like the flagship store on, Madison Avenue of Polo or something. It was like, let's show everything we can make and do. Everything hand painted, handmade, restored in the medieval fashion. He worked with a company called John Hardin, who had to figure out how to do all these things again. Here's the top of the rood screen. There's the rood, which is the cross, and behind that would be the altar and the sanctuary. And then this is the view on the other side of the sanctuary. This is the original high altar here. They added this altar fairly recently to say Mass facing the people, but they tried to make it look like it had always been there. Now this is either your dream or your nightmare, depending on what you think, right? Is this walking into Willy Wonka's chocolate factory and just going around in this mythical time and space, or is it, oh my gosh, how can I not have nightmares after spending time in here? Glimmering, shimmering, bronze gates, painted patterns, all these based on archaeological examples that he found. The tabernacle with these medieval vestments. There's something called a Gothic vestment that many priests wear now. You may have seen fiddleback chasubles, which are the ones that are shaped kind of like a violin. Those were the common ones in the 18th century. Then he figured out, well, the medieval ones were actually big round pieces with a hole in the top and they were full. And so the shape, I think you had a Gothic chasuble on today at Mass. And they're very, very common now. Pugin's the guy who rediscovered them. And he also figured out that, that there was a painting tradition in England. And so this is again in the sanctuary. And then the church looking from the entry door. So this could be fascinating, or you could say, oh, is there Mass going on in this museum of archaeological rediscovery? And it's a little of both. Those wall paintings are kind of incredible. And the Stations of the Cross are colorful, but this is a real thing to say, we're bringing back the thing that Henry VIII ruined. We're English, we're going to get back to our authentic Englishness. And so you see in the same place, there are angels at the high altar. They're holding little censers, just like the heavenly descriptions in the book of Revelation. And then these colors and gems. Are all these walls made of rubies and sapphires and pearls? No, but they kind of evoke that notion of the jeweled walls of the heavenly Jerusalem. And here's the baptistry, One of the things that England, the baptismal font, one of the things that England was known for before the Reformation was alabaster. They made alabaster statues, and that was the great glory of England. You know, France had what it had, Rome had what it had, and England had alabaster, and then all these things were destroyed, many of them in the Reformation. So to make a baptismal font out of alabaster and then cover it up with gold and paint, again, was we're here and we're not going anywhere. Catholics are allowed to be Catholic again, and we're going to show you what we can do. And I have a rich lady who'll pay for all of it. And so this is what is called encaustic tile. So this is basically stoneware in the middle, and then they would have these little things kind of like cookie cutters, and they place them on top, and they pour liquid clay of different colors into it. Then they take the shape out and fire it. And this was another one of these things that medieval England was very, very good at. And he found some of them all over the place and then figured out how to make them again. And this was the end of his glossary of ecclesiastical ornament. This was his ideal end of the book. It's like the end of your life at a funeral. And so you have very pious monks holding very pious and large candles. And you have a casket and this pall that's based on medieval principles, and then this curtain here is called a dossal curtain, D-O-S-S-A-L, with the side curtains on either side, and here's a Gothic chasuble and an altar covered up and all these things. So this is the Willy Wonka's chocolate factory of heavenly medieval color and fabric and gem and handmade. This is the Catholic Shire. Now you can buy some of these things around. Pugin is well known. I saw this for sale at an auction. He worked with Minton, the tile place, and made these Gothic Revival tiles. So they were estimating $600 for a crate full of Pugin tiles. You know, I don't know what you do with them, but they're pretty neat. And then you could see them close up there. Remember the garden imagery, the sense of color, of gem colors, the jewels. This is like a necklace of beads here. And then on the back, Minton and Company. So these were made by the same industrial methods that Pugin was not happy about, right? They're coming from some factory that's replacing this church steeple somewhere, but he's trying to bring these back. And so there's his glossary of ecclesiastical ornament cover page, and everybody's rediscovering things. The monks are over here making vestments, and they're up here painting and chiseling, and then the priest is walking in to say mass. So, if you want to see this online, it's actually, you can flip through it page by page in a virtual document. Just put in Pugin ornament as a Google search and you'll be able to see it. And here are some of the things inside his book. This is a cope, which you will often see at weddings or for Eucharistic adoration. It's worn like a cape over there. And then this is a chasuble laid out flat. The priest would stick his head through there. And then all the different colors and shapes and everything that people had forgotten. And even lettering. If you see Gothic churches and it might have the name carved out front in this medieval lettering, these were things that he figured out and put in books. So there's all these different medieval authentic fonts and colors. And so, the Gothic craze took over, and it wasn't always Catholic. These are Gothic Revival clocks from the 19th century, and these are available. I like to look at this website. It's called invaluable.com, and it's an aggregating website for auctions around the world, and you can put in a word for anything you want. So I put Gothic in every now and then, and you get Gothic clocks and Gothic tables and Gothic everything that's nothing to do with the church. Gothic chairs. I found this Gothic high chair recently. I didn't buy it, but if you were a rich person in England and you're like, look how sophisticated we are, let's put our baby in a Gothic Revival chair and feed them in the morning. So when things become fashion, they often are separated from their original intention. But it's very influential. Suddenly people are printing books, and there are pictures appearing in newspapers, and the books are going across the Atlantic. And here's St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. There it is under construction. When it was built, there was nothing up there. It was all fields. And little by little. So this is the American Catholics saying, you know what, we're poor Irish immigrants, but we're making a very sophisticated church. And they hired an architect named James Renwick, who was Protestant, but he was the leading Gothic Revival architect in the US and built the great flagship church. There are other ones. This is the famous Trinity Church down by Wall Street. This is the Catholic Cathedral in Toronto, made of brick, but very much the same English Gothic inspiration. And this is in India. And of course, the British went to India and they brought their Anglican high church stuff with them. So the interesting thing about Pugin, even though he was telling the Protestants, we're Catholic and this is authentic, there's a segment of the Anglican church that went high church called the Oxford movement, and they started adopting all of the English Catholic medieval stuff, even though they were Anglican Protestants. And so then they took that to India and brought Gothic revival architecture there. And when it came to the US, there was the unlimited budget of the guy who invented everything, and then there were Americans who bought things out of catalogs. Sort of inspired by the same thing, but a little plaster, maybe not as sophisticated, maybe the colors are not quite right. So you always have this challenge, which is the guy with all the money in the world and all the talent starts a movement, and sometimes those movements are good and sometimes they're not. This is the Basilica at Notre Dame, again, very much out of this movement, although it comes through the French stream of it, through the French religious order there, Congregation of the Holy Cross. It's not called Notre Dame for nothing, right? Even though we Americans call it Notre Dame. It's Notre Dame, the French, it's the University of Our Lady, really, but we don't call it that. And then there are big churches all throughout New England at this time, covered in paint everywhere. This was repainted recently by a company called John Canning, trying to bring back the original intention. Now, when you hear terms like noble simplicity from Vatican II, oftentimes they're responding to stuff like this. There's a line in Vatican II in the document on liturgy that says, the church calls no style her own. And it's basically saying you don't have to be Gothic. Even though Pugin says it's the only true Catholic style, you don't have to do it. And Cardinal Newman, who's the Catholic convert later in England, called Pugin an architectural bigot because he only said Gothic was right, and he built himself this Roman-style church in London. But here it is, Episcopal Church in Hartford, and they even do things, they recovered patterns in the roof with slate of different kinds. And probably the grandest of all of these was the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City, which was the Episcopal Cathedral of New York. Started in the late 19th century and is still not finished. The towers are not finished, but it's open. And they're really saying, can you imagine, in late 19th century, early 20th century, we're going to build the largest Gothic cathedral in the world. And we're going to make it out of stone. This is the largest Gothic cathedral in the world, still. Bigger than anything in Europe. And they thought they could do it. No steel, stone on top of stone. And this is what it looks like on the inside. Those are people down there, right there. This is a big, big place. And these big piers, you probably take 20 people around to get around them. And they're all stone. And they're just piled on top of each other with no steel in there. And there's some great photos of them bringing the stone up on these carts up Broadway to get up there. The Episcopal Church had all the money in New York back then, and they were able to do these kinds of things. And this was their plan for the screen behind the altar, these big, big columns. These are one piece of stone that they had to get up there. So, here's the altar proper right there. So a priest would be yay big, and then all the way up there. And maybe you've seen the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. It's the same period. Gothic, medieval, in this case, it's the Episcopal Cathedral, even though it's the National Cathedral, but it's all stone on stone. They had an earthquake in DC a couple years ago, so they've been repairing these, and they have these guys cutting stone exactly in the medieval method, except with the electric hammers. And I did a Google search, Gothic churches in Nebraska, and this came up. Everywhere you go, Gothic revival churches all over the place. And even yours, right? I found this postcard is for sale, by the way, for $15 on eBay. And there's your little version of this great worldwide movement.
Missing the exhaust or the furnace.
The furnace exhaust? Oh, so something got added later. So now you know a little bit of your building history. There was also a door here for your baptistry. You could go out that way. The door's still there, but the step's gone, or you don't use it, right? This door over here. So you can start to see your building history. There's one tower is taller than the other. This is a little picturesque movement. And then the pointed windows and the big windows on the side. And all started with some kind of really slightly crazy Gothic revival architect, Pugin, 80 years earlier. Now, this is what they call the romantic mind, right? So this theologian here said, when you're thinking romantically, art is understood as something in the emotions. It's the feeling, I want to feel old-timey. And if you read Pugin's books, he doesn't say, I want to make a sacramental image of the heavenly Jerusalem. He says, those feelings that we had in the Middle Ages, we need to get those feelings back. dark corners and mysterious, moody interiors. And so this is kind of the romantic baby Jesus, right? It's sort of put a Coke bottle in his hand and he could be an advertisement in the same period. This is kind of our modern romantic vision of the laughing Jesus, because we don't want the angry Jesus, we want the laughing Jesus. And we know he had a really good orthodontist there. And then, Jesus at the home plate with the little leaguers. This is not wrong, it's just, we want to exteriorize our own emotions, and this is a little bit of what happens. Now, when people do this kind of stuff, sometimes it's not so hot. So here is a church in Ireland. Of course, Ireland finally gets its Catholic emancipation too, so they're like, we're going whole hog. And they hired somebody pretty good. This old picture, this is the same church here. Lots of Gothic stuff. Stones painted on the walls that aren't really stones, and then this looks like architecture, but it's all painted there, and then these giant oversized things, and then there's this giant altarpiece, which is very impressive. And you kind of say, is there an altar in that Gothic jungle somewhere? Because they're much more interested in the style necessarily than the actual prominence of the altar. It's pretty darn impressive, and it's still there. But here's the tabernacle. Should the tabernacle really be a stand for a diorama of the Last Supper? These are questions that you have to ask yourself. And should the tabernacle be this big and this adoring angel be twice as big? It's not that any of it's wrong. It's just like a consonantia problem, if you remember the proportionality questions from the last talk. And then this was the old cathedral in Hartford. This was the pulpit with this canopy on it. It's a little hard to see, but there's a big tower rising up here, and there's a flying buttress over here. And we had someone here who said, when are you going to talk about buttresses? And now she's out of the parade. But what was her name? Veronica, yeah. Tell Veronica that I talked about buttresses for her. But a buttress is a thing that holds up a heavy wall when there's a lot of load coming down with outward thrust. And that's not happening there. But they're using a buttress as a kind of ornament. Pretty impressive stuff. But a lot of things, they say the Victorians had what they call a horror vacui, or a horror of empty space, which is often the case. And this was a church in Brooklyn. There's an altar there, but this big frame thing kind of looks like it came out of the front cover of a book. Someone didn't really know how to do all of this. And some of these are really intriguing. The Holy Name of Jesus Church in Brooklyn, you can see very much like yours, 3 altars, except these altars are really close together. In fact, they form kind of like one big backdrop, and you can see the altar boards would go in these little curtains in between. So is someone really going to say Mass there and there and there at the same time? Probably not. So people were saying, sure, it's nice, but liturgically, does it make sense? And the sanctuary is really, really tiny. Was there enough room for processions? And where's the ambos? So sometimes style was overwhelming the need. This, by the way, is the renovation they did on it. Same church, this one became this one. So it makes you wonder what people have bad ideas all the time. So all the stages of your church, from the early version to the renovation to the renovation to the re-renovation, they're mirroring the larger culture. It was re-renovated and improved. Sorry, I don't have a picture of it. But all this is happening in the context of something called the liturgical movement. So these scholars around the world, mostly starting in Europe, are rediscovering the liturgy after the French Revolution. So the French Revolution happens, there's a secular state in France. They murder a lot of nuns, and they tear down the monasteries. And then especially the Benedictines are like, we have to bring monastic life back. We have to bring authentic liturgy back to France. And there are various names, if you know theology, these are all writers. And the US had its own version. Virgil Michael was up at St. John's in Collegeville. Randall Hillenbrand was in Chicago. Martin Hellriegel was in St. Louis. And they were influenced by this new research. Now, if you've ever been to an extraordinary form, low mass, where you don't answer and you don't sing, and the priest whispers everything, that's what they would have called the rubrics of the private mass, when a priest didn't have a congregation. And eventually those became the norms for masses with a congregation, and it's been that way for hundreds of years. And then these people started doing research, and they find out that St. Ambrose describes a mass in his time, and the people all answered the priest. He said, what? The people said, and with your spirit, back to the priest, we haven't done this in a long time. And so all this archaeological work started to say, why don't we do some things that might change? I don't know, we were talking about different kind of trads earlier. Are you a rad trad, or a tad trad, or a dad trad, or whatever your liturgical sensibilities are? I'm not blaming anybody for, what'd you say, Father?
Bishop Conley says he is a glad trad.
A glad trad, there's another one. Or mad trad, or some people are like that. But there were certain things that were kind of strange. Like the Easter Vigil was at 8 o'clock on Saturday morning.
Yeah.
The Easter Vigil talks about the light and the darkness and the night and the Easter candle and all. Just by an accident of history, it started getting earlier and earlier and earlier. And they started saying, we could do some liturgical reform. And eventually it led to what we think of as Vatican II. And this is the movement. And one of the big people pushing this was St. Pius X, who became Pope turn of the century, and he was the first Pope to use the phrase active participation in liturgy, and he meant it in the context of Gregorian chant, that people should sing Gregorian chant, and that was active participation in the liturgy. And if you've ever seen a hand missal like this, where they have Latin on one side and English on the other side, this was invented around this time, and what they would say is, don't sing at Mass, sing the Mass. You know, pious little songs, Little Town of Bethlehem, is a nice song, but the Mass gives you a text that says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. These are the propers. You'll see entrance antiphon, communion antiphon, offertory antiphon. So the source and summit missal that you have is actually trying to do this original intention. So like use the text of the liturgy, sing the Gloria, sing the Creed, start paying attention to liturgical colors. Oftentimes masses were being said for dead people every day, and every day they'd wear black vestments. You know, it wasn't the liturgical season. And certain things like that, pay attention to that. And if you are transformed by grace better, you're going to love your neighbor because you're going to be filled with God's love. And then this spilled out into social concern, and they call that the social reconstruction or social justice movement. But interestingly, Pius XII called active participation intimate union with Christ. We think active participation is stand, move, say, be a lector, be an extraordinary minister, and that is active participation. But if you remember what the actual liturgical thing is, the priest is the head of the body, sacramentalized. The people are the members, and what we're doing is what Christ is doing. He is offering himself to the Father in this participation in the offering of self. So Pius XII said, that's active participation. Offer yourself through the head of the body, which is the priest, to God the Father, and then you're participating in the dialogue of the Trinity. Now, sometimes that extends out to other stuff, like being a lector or extraordinary minister, but that's not the primary thing. And so what they really wanted is get people to know that they were members of this same body, and they were joined with the heavenly beings. So this is a little picture from one of those missals, and there's the priest walking in with the altar boy, and then notice the big giant tabernacle. This is not the little cabinet tucked into the screen behind. And then the angels are there too. So this notion that it's a heavenly activity and an earthly activity, this is all kind of new stuff. And they wanted people to drink deeply from the wells of grace. So you'll often see at this time pictures of deer drinking from running streams. And the deer here were the people who before, for whatever reason, were not participating in liturgy fully, and therefore were not being transformed by grace. And now the divine office, which we celebrated today before the first talk, Holy Mass and the sacraments, all honor and glory to God. And then the indispensable source of the true Christian spirit is the liturgy. This is Pius X. And so it's a little hard to see here, but this is a canopy over an altar, and these are two birds here, and they're drinking out of a little flower, and here the birds are drinking out of the chalice. And this was the sign of people now participating more fully in the liturgy. Partly they're wondering, why did the French Revolution happen? Like, eldest daughter of the church is putting a prostitute on the altar at Notre Dame and worshiping her as the goddess of reason. How could this happen? They mustn't have been being transformed by grace. So this cultural crisis, and they say, we gotta get back to the authentic Roman way of celebrating liturgy. And so they start asking the question, what is first in a church? Father H.A. Reinhold said the liturgical movement, for some reason the V is missing there, can be summed up as putting first things first, second things second, and peripheral things on the periphery, which I think is a really good summary. So you ask, what is first in a church? And he would say, things related to the Mass, the altar, candles, crucifix, tabernacle. What's second? Liturgical imagery, vestments, and then what's peripheral? Other stuff. Now these are all important, but if you had to have the hierarchy, you would do it this way. So what they wanted to do was make the altar more prominent. And one of the leaders of this movement was Geoffrey Webb, who's an architect in England. And he wrote a book called The Liturgical Altar. And he said the reason the church gives all these directions to the altar is it's the reason for being in which the building stands. You have the building to enclose the altar. You don't design a building and then toss an altar in later. The church exists for the altar rather than the altar for the church. It's the sacrificial stone on which Christ, our priest and victim, offers himself daily in his Eucharistic sacrifice, which is made known by our sacramentalization of the universal of that sacrifice. The altar represents the Lord himself in architectural form. He's the altar, he's the priest, he's the victim, and he says reverence for the altar, with its dignity of its design, with its restraint, symbolizes the reverence for Christ itself. So priests come in at the beginning of Mass, they kiss the altar, which we're sort of used to, but you don't go home and kiss your dining room table, right? It's kind of a weird thing to kiss furniture, but he's offering that reverence to Christ. So Christ standing amidst his people. So if the altar looks like a kind of flimsy thing, that unimportant, or if you've redefined ontologically the church as the dining room of God, and suddenly your altar looks like a dining room table, you're kind of missing out on the nature of the altar itself. So they would look at these 19th century altars and say, yeah, they're pretty good. But there was a criticism that happened that they would say that the altar had become a shelf for architectural virtuosity. Right? The altar itself is kind of lost in this Puginesque Gothic. And oftentimes they'd only have 1/2 or 1/3 of the altar because they wouldn't build the back part of it because you couldn't see it. All this stuff was on top of it. And they called them sometimes derisively the packing crate altars because you could go around the back and it was hollow and the altar boys would be storing things in it. And if the altar is Christ, he's the sacrificial stone, and they would either make this out of wood and paint it to look like marble or make it out of plaster, they would say, we're not doing this very well. Right over here is a little altar. I don't know where it comes from, but there's a little square on the top where the altar stone would have been. The stone in that square was the altar, because the altar had to be stone. All of this other stuff was the stuff that held the 1 square foot stone. And so this is not legitimate for a church that should have this altar as its center thing. And they said the tabernacle was like a little cupboard here instead of being visible, and the altar candles were lost. So they said, this is good, but we can do better. And you can see side altars like this. Do you need a side altar if you never say Mass there? They would say, well, have a shrine, fine, but don't have altars that never get used as an altar. It was just a custom that nobody had realized was a problem. So you see St. Joseph here holding the child Jesus, and there's St. Joseph and Jesus up there, and there's Jesus over there, and St. Patrick over there. And so this notion of kind of a cluttery Victorian mess was how they saw a lot of these buildings. Pious, yes, but kind of messy. So what they said is tabernacle was explicitly forbidden by law to serve as a statue base. It was not allowed. It was absolutely forbidden, and everybody was doing it all the time. So is the tabernacle just a statue base with a hole in it? Not really, not ontologically. And then there was all this other kind of devotional art that would crowd out the primacy of the altar. So that's the introduction. We'll take it back to St. Patrick's Cathedral. Can you see what a liturgical movement scholar would critique about this? If you were in the mind of one of those people, what would you do with this? What would you say? What's a problem here?
Get confused. What's the altar versus the back?
Yeah, what's the altar versus the altarpiece?
The altar, yeah.
Right? Here's this little altar, and then here's this giant altarpiece. And they needed to be scaled to this big church, but then that made the altar look really tiny. They didn't destroy this, they actually took it apart and gave it to another church, I think at the seminary. But look at some of these other churches. I just put Gothic church in. We look at some of the big ones. This one is in Elroy, Wisconsin, wherever that is. Look at these giant altars, big, big altars. Is it great architecture? Not really. Are these great paintings? Not really. These giant, larger than life-size statues. And if you're not going to say Mass at these altars, should you have 3 big altars would be a question. Here's a church in France. Where's the altar? What's going on? You have all kinds of stuff all over the place, this kind of pious clutter, which is pious, I'll admit. But there's the altar, but it's a little hard to see in this picture. Here's another church with the same kind of problem with this. All the stuff is there, but the sanctuary is tiny, and the rail is there, but then this giant altar piece, and then the altar is hollowed out, and there's a plaster image of the dead Christ in there. Nothing wrong with the veneration of the dead Christ. It's just, should you hollow out the altar in order to do it? So what they proposed was the canopy. They looked in the liturgical law for the first time, and it was first translated into English around this time. And they said, here's how to make the right kind of altar. It's freestanding, so you can get all the way around it. It has a front and a back. It's made of stone. The tabernacle, the candles, and the crucifix are now very prominent and not hidden in all that altarpiece, and then a canopy over it. These were rules made by St. Charles Borromeo after Trent for his diocese. And all of a sudden they said, well, how did the ancient church do this? Well, they had a canopy over the altar at St. Peter's. Oh, they have a canopy over the altar at Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. Oh, they have a canopy over the very ancient church of San Lorenzo in Rome. And this seems to be the Roman way. Now, the French, remember, were like, why did our church fall apart? We've got to go do things the Roman way, the simple, noble Roman way. And then they start showing up in American, very grand churches. You might recognize the one on the right, that's St. Paul's in Minneapolis. And this is St. Louis Cathedral. Quite an amazing array. It's one of the largest, if not the largest, collection of mosaics in the United States in the St. Louis Cathedral, built in the 1910s and 20s. And then you go back to St. Patrick's. What have they done here? The big altarpiece is gone. The altar is visible, the cross, the candlesticks. Originally it had a curtain back there. It never had a tabernacle there because it was always in the chapel in the back because of all the tourists. But a lovely thing. You might say, we tore down our marble altarpiece. What are we going to get? But back then, they were like, we can get something better. Now we would assume we would get something worse or nothing, because we don't trust architects anymore. No offense, Kevin, but we often don't trust architects because of what they did to our churches. So here's a church in Louisville, Kentucky, and it was a typical Pugin-inspired Gothic church. Altars like this, by the way, came out of catalogs, and you could flip through, if you're old enough to remember a Sears catalog, and they would be like AZ-021, and you'd order the catalog altar, and then they would just put it in place. And this is not a bad church, but you see there's a lot of things on the walls, and the altar is this little bit here. And what they decided to do was this, in this renovation. So they made this wooden version of the big canopy at St. Patrick's. There was bronze with the big crucifix, the freestanding tabernacle, and the 6 candles there. And so you see they have their New York inspiration, but then they do it in Kentucky in a slightly less expensive way. But a very fine piece of architecture there. And then they've paneled the walls back here with wood. And there's 1,000 ways to do this. This is in St. Paul, Minnesota as well. Big dark bronze tabernacle against the light stone Gothic ornamentation, the big crucifix, and then this is the canopy. They followed the law, but just barely over the tabernacle. And then marble, real marble altar, marble slab, marble front, and fine materials, inset mosaics, and so on. And you can do this sort of infinitely. How many different ways are there to make a liturgical movement altar? And when I teach this class, I just teach the students, can you still do this, Ben? I won't put you on the spot. Ben Norris was in my class years ago. Freestanding tabernacle, freestanding altar, 6 candlesticks, big cross, and a canopy. It's a Johnny one note. But then here's the same thing again. This is the Wheeling Cathedral we saw a couple times. Freestanding altar made of fine material, big tabernacle, candlesticks. There's a little crucifix there, and then the canopy over it. And if you can read this funny lingo here, it's et bibit meum sanguinem. Instead of just a pious phrase like Saint Joseph, pray for us, they would say, drink my blood, right? If you follow it all the way around, it says, eat my flesh and drink my blood. Very liturgical in its text there. And there's the whole thing. And then it's in the context of this whole heavenly vision. So here's your altar, here's your canopy, here's your tabernacle, and then it extends outward kind of infinitely to Christ on the throne, the angels, the saints, the stars, and the planets, and all the way it wrote elders. This was the kind of peak of theological sophistication at the time, and they're basing it on some of the Roman basilicas. This is San Clemente in Rome. It's quite famous for its mosaic with its tree of life, but notice the freestanding altar with its canopy, and the saints are present, and then the heavenly Jerusalem is up here. They did it in their way. We saw this last night, remember, St. Paul outside the walls, there's the little Pope down there. Same thing, garden, heaven, angels, saints, Christocentric. And so when you look at the comparison, this is the chapel at the Josephinum, which is a seminary down in Columbus before it was renovated. And then the earlier Christian, you can see the resemblance. Here's Christ dressed as a priest, and he's surrounded by angels of different kinds, and then the different stages of priesthood are listed there. And this is how they renovated it in the 1980s. They're like, pictures are bad, they distract you from the liturgy. Vatican II asks for noble simplicity, so let's do that. But I always think someday I'm going to have a bar bet. I'm going to be in a bar and someone's going to say, didn't Vatican II say church architecture should have noble simplicity? And I said, I'm going to bet you my 401k that Vatican II never said noble simplicity for art and architecture, because it didn't. It said the rites, the vestments, and the ornaments should have a noble simplicity. It said the art and architecture should have noble beauty. And now you know what beauty is, the revelation of ontology. What's the ontology of the liturgy? It's heavenly and earthly. So this is not foreign to the liturgy, this is proper to the liturgy. But nonetheless, at the time, people said, oh, that's a distraction from the liturgy, let's paint it beige. They re-renovated this a few years ago, and that's what it looks like now. They actually reproduced the painting and changed it up a little bit. So this notion of an old thing getting beigified and then getting brought back to its glory is not a foreign thing. And if you do something like that here, you'll be part of a bigger movement that's going on. And so why was this removed? Why was your old high altar removed? And why were the two side altars simplified? What they wanted to do is just what we've been talking about. Bring out the primacy of the altar. Rather than being in this altarpiece, they put a dark curtain behind it so that it would stand out rather than being, in the same color as the backdrop. And then the tabernacle got bigger, the crucifix was more obvious, the candlesticks are more obvious, and then this image up here isn't just, I don't know, saints standing around, it's Christ the high priest. They wanted people to know that the high priesthood of Christ was part of what they were doing. They were offering themselves to the Father and together with the saints, and the rainbows, a right relationship with God and humanity, and there are the deer drinking from the running streams. This is all very much the theological movement of its time. Now, you might have an opinion. I think that's better. I think that's better. They're both legitimate, but this was a very important theological move at the time, that people should know what they're doing at Mass, that they should join themselves to the high priesthood of Christ, and that's why he's wearing vestments there. So that's the end of this one. Hopefully what this tells you is that you have a kind of a long history here of intellectual prehistory that goes back to the Reformation. Well, some guy in England is really mad about Henry VIII, and he's coming back with medieval Gothic architecture, and it creates a movement that somehow lands in Hastings, Nebraska. And then the theologians in Europe are writing books, and somehow it lands in Hastings, Nebraska. And then in the 60s, there's a new set of theologians saying, you have to get rid of all this stuff to focus on the altar. And it lands in Hastings, Nebraska. And now you're in a part where you're saying, well, what should we do for our church? Did we go too far? What should we bring back? What should we not do? That's a movement that's going on all around the country too, and it's just about to land in Hastings, Nebraska. So hopefully what these kind of talks will help you is to say, I know what I like, but let me think about this, intellectually, logically, and how can we make informed choices based on all of this, and then we will go forward in a way that's not just based in personal preference or emotional anger or whatever, but actually makes a whole lot of sense. How are we doing on time here, Father? I think this one turned out a little shorter than we imagined.
Yeah, so we did have lunch scheduled at 11:30, but maybe we can move that up to as soon as we're ready to eat.
Okay, so we'll take a little bathroom break or whatever.
And then eat.
They'll have lunch, and then there's one talk after lunch on the nature of sacred images. So I know there's probably going to be a tendency to want to drift away after lunch, but please stay. I'd love to answer some questions at the end and do whatever I can to finish off the day. So thanks very much, and
Thank you.
enjoy lunch.